Today's story, if you look in your bulletin, it says Genesis 16 and Genesis 21. It's kind of told in two parts. It's really the first 16 verses of 16 and the first 21 verses of chapter 21. And I'm not going to read all of it. So the first part is when Abram and Sarai have been promised that they will be the ancestors of a great nation. And they're feeling a little uncertain about that in their old age. At this point, Abram is 85. And so Sarai takes it upon herself to send her maid or her slave in with Abram, and she conceives, and so she's pregnant. Then Sarai saw that Hagar looked on her with contempt. And so she goes to Abram and complains about this, and Abram says, "Your slave girl is in your power, do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for the multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, and with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Ber Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. By the time Ishmael was born, Abram was 86 years old. So about 15 years or so go by, and finally, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And the boys are growing up together, and by this time they're called Abraham and Sarah. God has changed their names. And Sarah once again starts to feel threatened and does not want Ishmael to inherit rather than Isaac. So the child grew and was weaned. This is Isaac. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. So, you may have heard recently that the Southern Baptist Convention reaffirmed their decision not to allow churches to ordain or employ women pastors. Pastor Rick Warren had appealed this decision. It was an earlier decision. He appealed the decision because they had removed his church, Saddleback Church in Southern California. Rick Warren hoped they could agree to disagree on this issue. Over 9,400 delegates voted no on that appeal. And the Southern Baptist Convention, and they're not alone in this, will quote more than one scripture to uphold this prohibition. And we could go toe-to-toe with them on that. But this decision puts them in the position of questioning God's call to ministry of thousands of women, which seems pretty audacious to me. They're also betting that that writer, not to mention God, would not have anything new to say about women leading or teaching men in all this time. They have hung their hat on a single story, and no matter how much they're challenged, they're not changing their minds. So, I've talked before about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk. It is called "The Danger of a Single Story." And she warns of the risk that we take when we rely on only one perspective or one story to inform our understanding of people, of Scripture. She doesn't talk about Scripture, but I'm talking about Scripture. Based on her experiences as a Nigerian coming to the United States. She's a writer. She describes a professor who told her that her writing was not authentically African, because it did not fit his ideas of what African life must be like. So she looked into all this further, she thought about it, and she points out that assumptions about people based on just one perspective easily lead to misunderstandings and prejudicial thinking. When we don't question the way a story has been told or understood over a long period of time, we may miss the true meaning or overlook details that were there all along. At best, we operate with an incomplete understanding of who people really are or what a story can mean to us. And we do this with Bible stories all the time. We forget to be curious. We forget to dig deeper. We accept what preachers tell us because most of us don't have loads of time to research the original languages or read up on what commentators say. Part of my job is to study the Bible, and I do this all the time. I think I know what a story means. So I try to remind myself to question the text, to ask myself if I've bought into a single story in any way, and to see if there's another angle to explore. In Genesis, Abraham and Sarah are certainly written as the stars of this show. God has promised them more descendants than the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the beach. They are the patriarch and the matriarch of God's chosen people. God makes God's covenant with these people and their multitudes of descendants. The single story is that they are models of faithfulness, following wherever God leads. And even when they seem to behave badly, for instance, when they expel Hagar and Ishmael from their community, God seems somehow to approve of their actions. And Hagar is generally demeaned. Ultimately, her story seems not to fit with God's plan for God's people, so it's kind of easy to dismiss her and her son. Historically, this story has been used to explain the animosity between the different branches of Abraham's family, and even the strife over the land of Israel. As Debbie Blue, she's written a couple of really good books. This is Consider the Women, and a provocative guide to 3 matriarchs of the Bible. She's kind of my new favorite theologian, and she has said in talking about this story, we should try reading it differently. I kind of wanted to make that the title of the sermon. It's kind of my mantra when it comes to reading the Bible. We should try reading it differently. So in today's story, Abraham and Sarah, in their old age, they can't imagine how God's promise of all these descendants is remotely possible. Using a surrogate to bear children when a wife couldn't conceive was not an unusual thing in their culture. But we can also be certain that Hagar, as a slave, didn't have any choice in the matter. And once Hagar is pregnant, Sarah detects contempt, blames Abram, who remains fairly passive throughout this whole story, and allows Sarah to do what she will. And the text says she dealt harshly with Hagar. Hagar was abused and mistreated, and she ran away. The fact that God sends her back to Sarah is a little difficult to understand, but it's probably the only way she was able to survive. The second time she leaves, 15 years later, in chapter 21, she and Ishmael are given bread and water and cast out. Sarah demanded it. Abraham again complied. We read that Abraham was distressed, but also Abraham was reassured by God in what seems to be an attempt to preserve Abraham's moral integrity in this situation. It doesn't take a lot of digging to realize that as honored as Abraham and Sarah are, they aren't exactly models of faithfulness all the time, as they are typically portrayed. That could be a comfort to all of us. But as we read their story, and if you remember some of their story, there's a lot of deception and manipulation as they travel around after God asked them to leave their land and travel to a new land. They doubt God's promises. They take matters into their own hands rather than trusting God to work this out. Their descendants do the same thing. The stories of the Israelites after their escape from Egypt are rife with complaining and disobedience. Theology professor Frank Spina, who does a podcast called The Bible You Thought You Knew, writes that God's selection of Israel as a chosen people is all about God's immeasurable grace rather than any special status on their part. He says neither Israel's ancestors nor Israel itself in any period was ever presented as particularly worthy of having been divinely chosen. And he says that their status as God's chosen people has more to do with God's exclusivity in this ancient Near East culture. So remember, people believed in many different gods. Abraham and Sarah and their descendants believed in the one true God, who they called Yahweh, as the only living God worthy of worship or obedience. And Spina teaches that God chose Abraham and Sarah and Israel not to keep everyone else out, but to eventually make it possible for everyone to be included. This might be a topic for a whole nother sermon, But he reminds us that in Genesis 12:3, God says that through Abraham and Sarai, all families of the earth shall be blessed. Israel was chosen to be the vehicle that would bring all peoples together, where everyone would belong and no one would be an outsider. The way that Hagar, the outsider, was treated is not very surprising given her situation. But the beauty and the redemption in this story is found with Hagar's 2 encounters with God in the desert. So we heard in chapter 16, when she runs away from Sarah, God comes to her in her despair. Hagar is the first person in the scriptures to flee oppression. She's the first to have an encounter like this with God. The first to receive an annunciation when she's told she will bear a son and call him Ishmael. She's the only woman to receive a divine promise of descendants too numerous to count, so similar to Abraham's promise. She's the first woman in the ancestor stories to bear a child, the first slave who becomes a free person, the first person to weep. And Hagar is the only person in the Bible who names God when she says, "You are the God who sees." The version I read did not say it quite as clearly, but that's the name. You are the God who sees. And then later, in chapter 21, God once again comes to Hagar in the desert when she and Ishmael run out of water, when her hope is all but gone. God repeats the promise to make a great nation of Ishmael, and God opens Hagar's eyes to the well that saves their lives. God honors and blesses Hagar in significant and amazing ways. But that's not really the way I remember hearing and learning this story. Because after all that, this is pretty much the end of the Hagar story in our scriptures. We know that Hagar and Ishmael survive, and Hagar finds Ishmael a wife in Egypt. But the spotlight always remains on the primary story of Abraham and Sarah. On the other hand, there are many stories of Hagar and Ishmael in the Islamic tradition, where Hagar is considered to be the mother of monotheism, and Ishmael is considered to be the father of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, when Abraham takes Hagar and Ishmael into the desert, he leaves them at the site of the Kaaba, the holiest shrine in Islam, which is the destination of the Hajj, the pilgrimage that Muslims do every year, which coincidentally starts tomorrow. And as part of the Hajj, pilgrims run 7 times between these 2 hills, which is a reenactment of Hagar's search for water in the desert. So part of their annual pilgrimage is reenacting Hagar's actions. Then the well that they eventually drank from, they drink from the well, and they take water home in memory of Hagar. And also in the Islamic stories, Abraham travels to visit Ishmael and Hagar throughout their lives. In our tradition, in spite of the way that God honors and cares for Hagar in the desert, she is still considered an outsider. In fact, the word Hagar means outsider or stranger. And while we can't attribute the same racial caste system that we're familiar with to their ancient Near East context, the fact remains that Hagar was an Egyptian slave with few options in a very patriarchal society. It's not hard to think of examples where acceptance of a single story results in oppression or discrimination? You can probably make a list in your head. What is the single story that has resulted in the racial disparities in maternal mortality? Why are Black women 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women? Is there a single story that could possibly explain the Taliban refusing to allow girls to be educated? Or radicals to ban books for entire communities of people in our country? What is the single story that explains the increase in violence against women wearing a hijab, the Muslim head covering? Or the strong pushback we got when we hosted a drag queen story hour? Or the lack of safety felt by the LGBTQ community? Or the horrific violence against Black trans women across our country? It is clear that the ability to see past a single story is not just a nice idea. It doesn't just help us understand Bible stories better. It can save lives. We all know that single stories in religion or in the church have done significant harm over centuries. For this reason, it is imperative that we take the time to read these stories differently, with questioning, open minds, using our critical thinking skills, and it's imperative that we challenge the single stories when we see them in action in the world around us when they're harmful. The story of God blessing and working through the outsider runs through our whole Bible. Jesus and his disciples encountered all kinds of people considered to be outsiders. The Samaritan woman at the well, the Canaanite woman whose daughter Jesus healed because of her faith, the Ethiopian eunuch that Philip baptized. There's lots more. Or Moses would not have become a prophet if Pharaoh's daughter hadn't plucked him out of the river. Rahab hides the Israelite spies when they enter the promised land. Ruth, who was a Moabite, becomes an ancestor of King David. Hagar became the grandmother of a whole branch of the Abrahamic faith. And these are God's words in Scripture. You shall not wrong the stranger or oppress him. You and the stranger shall be alike before the Lord. Recognizing a single story that may be hindering our understanding of that story can be useful, especially with stories we find difficult to make sense of. Bible stories can help us understand how God's people saw the world and how they experienced God working in their lives. And God can reveal God's self through a story as well as through a person or an experience. But ultimately, we are committed to our faith because of our own experience of God and our longing for God's presence in our lives. Hagar's experience of God led her to name God, the God who sees. May you experience this God who sees and includes and loves, and in whom we all belong. Amen.